Beseder. So just a bit of a side point, but it will help us with nafkamin later on. What is reading? When you say reading, what do we mean, right? You're now to read Shitradyatot, what is reading? What is defined as reading? So just like we had in Tzochat Tzachav Deber Davar, right? So we learned there dibur, Deber Davar is speech, right? Dibur asur hilhur mutar, we said, right? You're not allowed to talk, you're not allowed to say things that are chol dik, but you are allowed to think about them. Now again, think about them, define how much can you think, how much, what are you allowed to think, what are you not allowed to think, there we learned over there. But fundamentally, right, you are allowed to think, you're not allowed to discuss. What is reading? When you say reading, what do we mean? So the Ravya brings B'Shem Rashbam, it's on page 4 over here. Shamati sheyesh chiluk ben kriya b'peh le'riyah be'alma. And here I was very torn about what Re'iyah Be'alma means. So Re'iyah Be'alma, you just like... Yes, there's a similar distinction. Right, because he isn't actually reading. Once again, over there's a good example, right? There's a Zera. If you have a candle, the good old candles that you'd read to, you're not allowed to read to light the candle because you might move it to increase the light. Right? Now, over there's a distinction between where you're reading proper and where you're just looking over someone else's shoulder to see that they're reading properly. So there with the Melamed, it works because the kids aren't going to play with the light because they have their Rebbe next to them, and the Rebbe is going to play with the light because he doesn't care to see the words properly. But am I allowed to take a paper and just look at it and read it properly just without actually enunciating the words? Presumably, of course not, right?
Well,
so what are you talking about? What's the issue?
Kriya has a recitation quality.
Right, and it's even stronger in the word here in the Ravya where it says kriya b'peh. So he seems to talk about two extremes, right? There's kriya b'peh, where you seem to be enunciating the words, right? Which most of us don't do normal, right? When you read things, you don't usually actually, right, verbalize, right? We just see them and that's it, right?
Well, it's more than that, though, because don't forget, they didn't have books in the same way that we have printed material. It was unusual to have something written out. So something had to be specially written, and
right,
then it would often be shared with others.
Oh, that is interesting. Okay. I have to think about how that affects our sugya. I'm just saying these seem to be two extremes. There's Re'iyah Be'alma, which Yaakov immediately took to, understandably, right, justifiably, took to, I'm just seeing, I'm not reading. The other in Kriya B'Peh. I'm not sure where we draw the line between actually enunciating the words and just seeing the page, but not actually reading it in the classic sense, right? When we say reading, we mean neither one, right? The word reading by us does not mean B'Peh, and it also does not mean Re'iyah Be'alma, right? It's something between. Usually, right? Of course, when I read with my 6-year-old, we're reading out loud, letter for letter, Beseder, right? Beseder. So the Shibola Leket, let's see the way he describes this machloket. Yesh metir hirhur belo kriya. What is hirhur? Once again, is hirhur what we call reading? Wonder. דעת אמרינן, דאסור לקרות, משום דכתיב למצוא חפצך ודבר דבר, דיבור אסור, הוא מותר. So once again, if I'm just looking at the page and I'm reading the way we explain the word reading, right? I'm just not enunciating the words, not verbalizing, right? I'm just looking at the words and doing what we call reading. But he says, wait, if there's no issue with hilhul on Shabbat, so when I look at the page, even if I understand everything, that's no more than hilhul. Now this seems to follow, again, these are all Balei Tosafot, just pointing out. Once again, Balei Tosafot who say the Zola from based on that same idea, you say, well, if I'm not midaber, I'm only seeing and thinking about what I'm reading, even if in my head I read word for word, that might not be as bad. I think he means to simply look and not verbalize. It seems to say. Ve'ino nira, understandably, because he says most of us don't read like that. Most of us, when we read, we just look. So. וכן כתב רבי בנימין אחי, דאפילו הרהור בלא קריאה אסור לפי שאי אפשר שלא יישא ויתם בדברי עיני איגרת. Rabbi Binyamin has a different issue with this. Rabbi Binyamin says, there's no way you're going to read it and not say anything about it. So again, there are two separate issues here. One is we have two extremes, right? Kind of having a general look at the page, but not actual reading. That seems to be fine, right? Enunciating, verbalizing, right? Am I using the right words? All right. That's definitely a problem. What about just what we call reading, looking over, reading? I don't know. I'm not sure. Rabbi Binyamin points out another issue, which is even if you're going to look at just have a rudimentary glance, still you'll end up thinking about it. You'll end up discussing it. It's a slippery slope. No, reading is Torah.
Yeah, but you're...
Rabbi Nechemia, we don't hold like Rabbi Nechemia. No, don't go that far. What would Rabbi Nechemia say about learning? Rabbi Nechemia would say that learning is a bitul Torah, yes, but practicing learning, right? You have to learn, right? Now, the Shulchan Aruch Harav says the whole discussion here is not about the first Zera. I pointed out many times. There we have two layers here, right? One layer is the Zera of the Easter of reading Shiur Detot, and the other is Zera Shema Ikra Shiur Detot, right? So the Shulchan Aruch Harav points out that this whole discussion, the Rishonim, in the Baalei Tosafot mainly, are you allowed to look over, right? I'm not even sure what's right, how far to, but let's call it look over things as long as you don't read them proper. Only refers to the second layer of the Zera. Let's have a look in the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Shiur Detot, דהיינו שטרי חובות, מקח וממכר, משכנות, חשבונות, בחפצים האסורים לעשות בשבת, אסור לקרותם בשבת משום למצוא חפצך, ואפילו לעיין בהם בלא קריאה אסור. ולא אמרו שדיבור אסור הוא מותר, אלא כשאין דבר ניכר שמערער בחפצים האסורים. אבל כאן שניכר לכל שמערער בחפצים האסורים הכתובים בשטר, הרי זה בכלל אסור למצוא חפצך. So this, presumably, would go against the way I explained the Rav Yah earlier, right? I said, the Shibolalaket said, says you're not allowed to say, but you are allowed to think. So if I just have my business documents in front of me and I'm just looking them over, not saying anything, just looking them over, no difference, right? The same thing, right? No difference between thinking about it and looking, right? That seems to be what Shibolalaket says. Says Shulchan Aruch Harav, no. There are two separate things. One is, if you're only thinking, that's okay. If you're doing an act, the act of holding a paper in front of you and reading it, then even if you don't say anything, it's still a problem. The heter the Rav Yah had was only this. He said, why am I not allowed to read other things that are not business documents? Gzera Shema, I'll read business-related documents. Now, the Gzera Shema, and what's wrong with reading business-related documents, right? Again, we have the Gzera Shema, you'll read business-related documents because of then you have one step before that, where you're not allowed to read other things, lest you read business documents. Says Shulchan Aruch Harav, the way he explains the Rav Yah is, you're not allowed to read those other things that are not business documents the way you wouldn't be allowed to discuss things that are business related. But if you have neither that nor that, in other words, the paper I have in front of me is not a business one. The way I'm doing it is the way that would not transgress anyway. So there's no justification to go that far with the Zera. Right? In other words, if I have the business paper in front of me, so you can't say I'm only thinking it's in front of me. But it's not a business paper, it's something else. Well, if I'm reading it out, or whatever Kriya B'Peh means, if I'm reading it out, let's call it reading it out. If I'm reading it out, then that would be a transgression of Mitzvah Davar Davar. If only this was something that was the Ber Davar. But it's not that nor that, and that's why it's okay. That's the way he explains the Rav Yah. Most poskim don't accept this idea, but they add it as another reason for kula. Let's see in Shabbat Shalachti L'chata, Ayin Ba Shulchan Shlomo, the Gershaz, page 5. לעניין רשימת תפריטים של סעודת שבת ויום טוב, ייתכן ומותר להציץ בה כדי לראות ולזכור את הסדר. Later on we'll explain what this heter is based on. The idea of the heter is, for a mitzvah, you're allowed to have a rudimentary glance. You can't start reading it proper, but להציץ כדי לראות ולזכור את הסדר, right? Again, I was torn. I said we have some kind of scale between enunciating, verbalizing, reading out loud, right, or reading quietly, but right in that sense, on the one end of the scale, the other end of the scale, just a rudimentary glance. Where do we draw the line? Where's our reading? Where does that stand? So Gershad says, since I'm adding this kind of kula, it's kula dik anyway, so I'll only allow that much. I'll only allow having a rudimentary glance.